Building a custom subwoofer enclosure for a truck underseat location requires more fabrication techniques than a typical standard enclosure. I'm currently working on building a custom downfiring subwoofer box for 3 JL Audio 13 TW5s. In order to match the shape of the seat, I need to include rounded corners, and to fit the tight underseat space, we must incorporate angles. I also need to add enclosure bracing, perfect cutout holes, and more. Hey everyone, I'm Mark. Welcome to CarAudioFabrication. In this first video of this underseat build log series, we need to complete all of the woodworking and detail work to all of these complex different pieces for the enclosure. Now real quick, before we get into it, a thank you to our sponsor for this episode, Crutchfield. If you need assistance with tech support or choosing gear for your car audio system, Crutchfield's US-based tech support team can assist. With free lifetime tech support for every product you buy, if you ever need assistance, they are there to help. Personally, I've purchased car audio gear from Crutchfield for a long time, long before I ever even started this YouTube channel, and I've always had a great experience. So next time you're shopping for car audio gear, definitely be sure to check them out, and you can also save on your next purchase with the links down in the video description. To get this party started, it is important that we have a plan. So we made this design a couple of videos ago, and we have a full blueprint here with all of our dimensions. If you guys need assistance with a custom design for your build, be sure to let me know. Reach out to me on my website, CarAudioFabrication.com, and I can help you with a blueprint as well. To begin, I'm going to start with making the back side of the box, the top of the box, and also the baffle that holds the subwoofers. I'm starting with making those pieces because those are the widest pieces I need. This panel here, I've already cut to 54 inches wide. Off of that large piece, I'm first going to cut the baffle, which has a dimension of 14 inches. Now, although I want a 14-inch cut, I'm going to start with a 14.5-inch cut. And the reason for that is I want to cut off this exposed edge here just because it's a little bit beat up. I want to have a nice fresh edge for our piece. So I'll make that cutting pass at 14.5 inches. I'm going to reset the fence at the final value of 14 inches, flip that board over, and get rid of the exposed edge. For this back piece, I need to cut it so that it is 5 7/16 inches tall, but I need to have that top surface of it that mates against the top board. I need to have that at a 13-degree cut. So we're going to take our angle cube here and zero it to the top of our work surface on the table saw, and then we're going to adjust the angle of the table saw to a perfect 13 degrees. Now I'm going to mark out the cut first with our pocket square here just to make sure that it's perfect, and I'm actually measuring this at 5.5 inches. I'm giving myself a little bit of extra material on purpose because later in the process we're going to router it flush. I'll have the extra bit of material hanging down lower over the baffle board, and we're going to ride the bearing of a flush trim bit against the baffle board to flush that up perfectly. Now with the material left over, I'm going to start making the next piece of the box, which is going to be the top. The back side of the top here also needs to have that same angled cut, so I might as well reuse what was left over from the previous cut. Once the top piece is fully cut, it should be about 15 3/16 of an inch from here to here, but again, I'm going to intentionally oversize this board, that way I can flush trim everything around the profile later. For that reason, it's not really important to have an angled cut on this side anymore because I'm going to be flush trimming with the router. So I'll set my table saw back to 0 degrees and make that cutting pass. Now the last board that we need to cut at that same 54 inches is the baffle board. The baffle board is the piece that has the subwoofer cutout holes in it, so it's going to be 54 inches wide and it's going to be 14 inches deep. It might not look like it needs to be 14 inches deep because of this piece setting into it, but we're actually going to incorporate part of this rounded profile as a layer of the baffle board, which means it does extend to that 14-inch dimension. So I'm going to knock out the overall dimensions of that real quick off camera. And with that, that's our 3 large pieces knocked out here. We've got the top board, we've got the back board, and we've got the baffle board. For the sake of time, I'm going to breeze through some of these next table saw cuts, so I need to make the front piece of the enclosure here. That's going to be 10.5 inches by 44 inches wide. And on that top surface, it again needs to have that angled cut. So let's make that piece. So let's double check here. 44, perfect, by 10.5. Next, I'm going to turn my attention to making the side panels of the enclosure. So I'll need to make 2 of these, of course, 1 for each side. And these have some detail work on them. There's a little notch in the lower corner that allows for some clearance in the vehicle. There's also an angle to match the angled top piece here. But I'm going to cut the overall dimensions on the table saw. So 9 inches deep there by 9 5/16 inches tall. Again, I'm going to oversize this dimension just slightly on the table saw because I'm going to be making the angled cut in a minute here on the router. I'll show you how we do that. Here's our 2 rough cuts just to verify dimensions. Each one is 9 inches wide and they're oversized at 10 inches tall. So I'm going to draw these dimensions on here. I'm going to measure 9 5/16. And I'm going to measure 7 3/16 inches on the backside here. Now, if I connect the outermost point of each of these lines here, just by using a straight edge, like that, I now have that angled cut. Now, this is where a lot of people like to take a miter gauge and they like to try to make this, perfectly match the angle so that they can make that cut through the table saw. But what I prefer to do is actually make this cut on the router. And the reason for that is I can be absolutely sure of where that blade is going to cut our piece of wood. I've just had too many times with the table saw where if that miter gauge isn't set up perfectly, you just slightly come off of your line and then it's not perfect. I've found that this technique here works a lot better for me, so this is what I like to do. I've applied some double-sided template tape and I'm going to stick this Mobile Solutions straight smart template on here. And you can see that I already know exactly where my cut's going to be because this is lined up with it. Here at the router, I've loaded in a spiral flute flush trim bit. This has 2 bearings up on top. It's a 1/4 inch bit, and I need to lower it down into the table, which I can do by turning this here. I'm going to lower it down until those bearings will actually ride up against the template, and I want to make sure that the cutting flutes of the router bit are going to fully cut into my piece of wood. A little something just like this. You can see the bearings are going to ride up against the template and the cutting flute down below is going to cut into the piece of wood and copy this template perfectly. Once we're done on the router, we can pop the template off and pull away our template tape there. And now we can double check this. This should be 9 5/16, which it is. And this here should be 7 3/16, which it is. Now, rather than taking the time to measure those dimensions again on our second piece, why not just copy our first piece here, and then we know that both sides are completely perfect and match each other. So I'll put some template tape on the back side of our original piece here that we made. Carefully line up all of the edges and apply pressure to stick these 2 pieces together. 2 side pieces are ready to go. Now the same process is going to apply to making the inside window brace here, at least the starting point of creating this shape. You can see it's a very similar shape. So I'm going to make these outside dimensions first, which looks like this. I made those cuts off camera. And now we can do our layout of all of the frame of the window brace here. You can see that this frame is going to be 3/4 of an inch typical, which means all dimensions are basically 3/4 of an inch, including that middle rib there. A really quick and easy way to lay this out is to just take a 3/4 inch thick piece of material, line it up with each edge and scribe a line. And then with a line that's measured to the middle of our brace, we can again use that piece of extra stock material to line out each side. For making these window braces, I am going to do some rough cutting here with the jigsaw. So to start the jigsaw blade, I need holes in each of the corners. So I've drilled 8 holes into the board, and I'm going to use that jigsaw to just rough cut, saving about 1/8 of an inch of material for the router to trim off. Now this time on the router, I'm going to use a 1/2 inch straight flute bit, and the reason for that is I want the larger 1/4 inch radius, since that's half of a 1/2 inch. I want that larger 1/4 inch radius in the corners here. That way I can use one of my larger roundover bits that has a matching bearing size in order to smooth out the inside edges here, which you guys will see in a minute. If that doesn't make sense, don't worry, I'll point it out in just a second here to make sure that you guys understand understand, but in the meantime, I'm going to template tape this in position, and I'm going to carefully start and stop where the lines are that I've marked the edges out. Now, after I carefully trim out this center rib area, we're going to turn our attention to the outside perimeter. So I'm applying some template tape once again, and now sticking some straight templates in place. And I will carefully cut those profiles to my brace as well, making sure that I'm careful not to cut into that center piece that we've already done. Now that took a little bit of time to make this window brace here, but the advantage of having one is we can simply copy this to our next piece. I'm again going to want to do some simple rough cutting on the jigsaw to remove this large piece of material, but we'll trim out the rest on the router. Now that I have both of these braces cut, I can show you guys what I was referring to earlier. This is the roundover bit that we're going to be using to soften up some of these 90-degree hard edges on the inside of this brace. And because this has a 1/2 inch bearing on it or a 1/4 inch radius, I didn't want these corners here to be any tighter than a 1/4 inch radius. So we use that same bearing size on our flush trim bit. These will be able to completely work themselves into the corner. If that corner radius was smaller, I wouldn't be able to get all the way into the corner with this bit. The roundover size itself on this bit is 1/4 inch, and you can see that I've lowered it into the table so that that corner edge right there is below the table surface. So now I can go around these inside edges and round them up. I really love the way that these window braces look after they have that roundover applied. The roundover just gives it a much more finished look. It allows for some smoother airflow, if you will, throughout the enclosure. Overall, like I said, a much more finished appearance and look. At this point, I pretty much have all of the raw pieces made that I need to start doing some detail work on. I kind of already did the detail work on the brace pieces there, but we do need to create these quick corners as well. So to make these, I'm going to be using one of the Mobile Solutions quick corner templates. In this case, we are going with the 5-inch radius quick corners. The way that these are designed, it allows us to add some curvature to the enclosure, but rather than using kerfing or like a traditional stacking method outside of this corner itself, we can have vertical boards that mate into these little notches here. You'll notice that there's a slight undercut into each of the corners, and that is intentional. The reason for that is so that we can copy with a 1/4 inch flush trim bit, and you can see that that bearing can get tight into the corner there. And because that bearing can get tight into the corner, what it does is it makes clearance for you to be able to have a hard 90-degree corner on your vertical pieces here and still have it fit inside. Now with the way these corners are going to stack up, I need to make a couple of different stacks. I need a stack that's going to give me a thickness of 1 3/4 inches. So since I'm working with 3/4 inch materials, what I can do is I can do 2 layers. That's going to give me 1 1/2 inches. And then I can add an additional layer of 1/4 inch MDF to give me this total here. I'll also be copying this profile to the baffle, and I've put the baffle layer in there just as a reminder. So its thickness is of course 3/4 inch because we've already cut that piece. Still need to do the detail work. But then our final stack and our taller stack here that's going to go on top, that needs to be 8 inches thick, which means I'm going to need at least 11 layers of 3/4 inch material. I'm intentionally going to make it taller than that dimension because we're going to be doing a cool router trick to trim that profile at an angle, and we'll talk about that more later. For now, let's get into making those stacks and go to a musical montage. So we now have the stacks here complete. Now don't forget, the reason that these are separated like this is these first few layers are going to be up until the baffle, and then they're going to have the subwoofer down firing. There's going to be a baffle layer, and then these are going to continue on top of that baffle layer. That baffle layer is essentially going to have this profile combined into it. So I want to turn my attention to making that piece now, along with adding these subwoofer cutout holes. This process, of course, once again begins with laying out all of these detailed cuts. I want to review really quick what we've got going on because this is somewhat of a complex layout and it will definitely make more sense now that we have everything drawn out. So these are our continuation of the quick corners here in the corner, obviously. And then I'm going to need to cut out a notch basically here and on the front, and that's going to be for the vertical board. So you can see I've set up one here just to simulate and give you guys an idea. So we have to cut that notch out so that this can pocket into there. Same with the front piece and obviously the other side. I covered this in the design phase of the project, but something that's really nice about the JL Audio shallow mount subwoofers is they have this tab ear style design, which allows them to be a lot closer to each other because this diameter here isn't carried throughout the whole diameter of the subwoofer. Instead, it goes in here. That way we can have more subs next to each other. You can see that once we make these 3 cutouts that I have marked out here, these are going to be very close to each other, but we do still have enough clearance for the 3 13-inch subwoofers within this dimension. You can also see how very close the subwoofer comes to the outside edge of the enclosure here, but again, we're going to have more than enough room because of that smaller tab ear profile. To make all these detailed cuts, I'm again going to be using the router, so I'm going to start with rough cutting out the excess material here. I'll use the straight templates in order to complete those straight sides that are notched for the vertical pieces. And then our other show sponsor, Mobile Solutions, also has these specific templates for the TW5 and TW3 series subwoofers, so I can easily cut out that cutout hole. And here it is. I love how with the router we're able to get such nice, crisp and clean lines. Perfect circle there on the inside for each of those subwoofer cutout holes. And I put this on here just so you can kind of get an idea how things are going to start to stack up. I of course need to attach this on the bottom side of the baffle, but it's looking good. There are a couple of more detailed things I need to do on this front piece here. I need to add this notch in the front. I also need to add that little notch in the corner on the side pieces. To make those, I'll be following the same process, again, rough cutting and using straight templates. And through the magic of video editing, here we have that notch. Again, just straight templates, very simple to add, and this notch for the side pieces. With all the woodworking complete, we will move into the assembly process in our next video. If you're new here and you want to join on the journey to mastering car audio, I'd love to have you as a subscriber. Next time you're shopping for car audio gear, definitely be sure to check out our show sponsor Crutchfield, and don't forget that you can save with those links down in the video description. A special thanks to them along with Jerry and the rest of the Patreon membership team for making these videos possible, and thank you so much for tuning in and watching.